Hey, Christine, welcome back to school.
Hey, Yaniv, thanks for having me.
Happy to have you on the show. Christine, listen, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions today because I was looking at your background and you have done so many things. I want to specifically start with your experience as a venture architect at BCG. What is a venture architect?
So, maybe to take a step back, BCG has a venture arm called Digital Ventures, and it is really about building startups and digital value propositions for corporate clients. And so, the venture architect role is really, if you want, a blend between a strategist, a co-founder, and sort of like someone that does everything necessary on the business side to kick off a startup.
Hmm. Okay. How do you get into something like that? I'm interested.
That's a fantastic question. I think there are different angles you can get into this. I do think that typically venture architects have a business background, a business and entrepreneurial background, whether it's dabbling into product management or having an innovation and entrepreneurship university degree, or have actually done and worked in a startup before.
So combining basically different disciplines. So you've got to be sort of a an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary person, right?
It's helpful, I'd say. I think it's just like someone being really like a doer, a hustler, someone, if you were to take on the lens of a hustler, a hipster, and what was the last one? Help me on that. Hipster, hustler, and what was the
And
third
an
one?
accountant.
Well, I can't remember, but essentially, if you were to look at the three different roles that you have in a startup, a product person, a designer, and then you have the business person. So the venture architect really is summarized best as that. And frankly speaking, every type of entrepreneur needs to have to wear different hats, right? So it's almost like that is also a very interdisciplinary role.
What do you, so if you had to put yourself in the shoes of the BCG CEO or whoever made up this role, why do you think that the role came up? Like, what was the need behind the role?
Very interesting. You know what? So I actually started with Digital Ventures back in 2014. And at that time, the role didn't exist or the title didn't exist. And I was put in as a product manager. And then people realized that that was a little bit misleading because there's a lot of other things that you do beyond a product management role, which is essentially figuring out the value proposition, figuring out the business model. So I think there were really smart people sitting in one room having some beer and brainstorming on a more appropriate title or a more appropriate role that really conveys the type of responsibility that you do as a venture architect. And now I feel like the world is running really rapidly, and not only startups are building new things but also corporates, and corporates definitely have a bigger need for that because their industries get disrupted, like banking, for example, with fintech, but also insurances, automotives, industries, they're all getting disrupted. And so there's this need for thinking about disruption and disruptive startups and building those themselves. And so the venture architect role is sort of, if you want, a entrepreneur in a bigger corporate that is looking at startup methodology as well as like building ventures from scratch. That's how I would distinguish a venture architect role from a co-founder slash a startup CEO.
And what does the day to day look like? Let's give our listeners sort of a taste of what the actual role entails.
Yeah, I think it's everything you do as a co-founder. So really figuring out what do customers or consumers want? Like what is actually the problem you're trying to solve here, right? And then going out and really talking to your target audience and then really figuring out, okay, what are some solutions or features you could do to really help those unmet needs. So it's a lot of tasks I would say you'd also do as an entrepreneur. I think what comes on top of it is stakeholder management because you're not a free entrepreneur in the market, but you actually serve a client. So you have a lot of like reporting back, but also that I feel like it's very comparable to reporting back to an investor, for example.
This was a service that BCG was offering its clients, but let's say that there's a CEO of a company listening to this podcast now, and they wanted to, launch this position within their own company. Is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea?
I actually think it really depends on how this role is embedded within the organization. Does this company or corporate have a venture arm? Do they typically have M&A resources or VC appetite, for example? I think is a good question. There are also questions around general appetite for innovation and disruption. Because, frankly speaking, I think innovation really needs to be driven by top management, and so, if this type of culture doesn't exist, there's no point of having a venture architect, right? Like that one person cannot really change anything because it definitely needs the support of the corporate. But having said that, I actually really truly believe that there's quite a bit of value from bringing a corporate and the startup world together, because as a corporate you do have assets that a startup doesn't have. So for example, you have a brand, you have a customer base, for example, you have distribution channels that typically a startup needs to build up still. On the other hand, the startup is much more flexible, quicker. You just do things and then worry about whether it was legal or not legal, or in the gray zone. Like you ask for forgiveness, right? That's kind of the mentality, and I think that is something that corporates lack or are having trouble to really execute on. So I think the venture architect role is really to bridge these two different worlds, and really coming up with ventures that are beneficial not only for a outside user or consumer, but also strategically important for the corporate. But in order to really strive as a venture architect, you do have to give them this type of environment where they can actually strive.
So it's not just the role, it's essentially the ecosystem around it. It's a systematic approach to building corporate innovation.
Exactly.
Okay. And while you were at BCG doing this role, could you share perhaps a few of the challenges and maybe on the other hand, a few of the success stories that you had?
I think one challenge that I also see with being at a corporate now doing an innovation unit is always the question around appetite and execution appetite, right? So a lot of people want to innovate. They are curious what's out there, and you come up with really fantastic concepts that are tested with the market, but it's really difficult to convert them to something tangible. Whether it is a MVP that actually at some point really generates financial return, or almost like a investment for the next 5 years. So that is the part where I think the challenge comes in, because typically corporates don't have a good process or structure in place that can nurture startups. And I think there are different ways to go to market. It's either a startup idea gets absorbed by the BU, um, or it gets spin out, and you find some outside investors. So there are different ways, but I think that is the biggest challenge generally when it comes to an innovation funnel, and when people think about, okay, what do we do now with this concept or this MVP or the testing? And I see a lot of these type of projects or ventures then actually ending, and that is definitely a challenge because you've put in so much resource and money into it.
I want to go back because I noticed in your background that while you were at Columbia University, you did some research about open innovation. I think it sort of ties into this role at BCG, and that open innovation research included an empirical study of a couple of companies and their approach to open innovation. So I wanted to know a bit more about the study. Like, what did it include? How did you run it? What did you find out?
Yeah, that was way back in the days. I think it was 2009 when I started getting myself into open innovation. And open innovation, just to clarify, it really means how can corporates or bigger, larger organizations absorb ideas. That's fundamentally what open innovation is. And it doesn't necessarily only include startups or collaborating with startups on POCs, but also internal employee generated ideas. And at the time, really, who was really strong in this field was definitely Google, or Google was always like the holy grail of uh, how to be innovative as an organization. So my research really focused on some of the more innovative companies that are trying to become more open-minded, that run open innovation challenges, that implemented design thinking. So I had some research partners within the space of technology, consumer, as well as like high tech, to really understand like what are some of the elements in place that are necessary to foster innovation. And so there were definitely like key factors such as top management support, different processes, different promoters that were necessary to really create this type of innovation environment that I was talking about earlier as well. And in terms of how to run this, I mean, it was like a 1 year study, and I was like doing interviews with various people within the organization to understand different perspectives and really bringing this all together in a framework.
Was there anything that you found interesting, like anything that surprised you in your findings?
What I thought was very interesting was how important top management support is. I think that there are a lot of initiatives run by employees, grassroots projects, initiatives, brainstorming sessions, sharing sessions, and so forth. But to really see innovation flourish and to see it on the balance sheet at some point in time, definitely top management support is the number one key driver. And I think I was never really aware how important it is. And just to give you an example, some companies that have had fantastic digital transformations or innovation transformations. One company that I'd like to share is Ping An, which is a Chinese insurance company, and it's been around for the last 3 decades, for example. And at one point in time, I think it was like around 2012 ish, they decided that okay, in order to really strive in the flourishing Chinese internet economy, they need to like really transform from a traditional insurance company to something more fintechy or more digitized. And so they really changed the entire strategy, saying, okay, technology is driving finance, and they've invested quite a bit of money. I think now they're investing um, 1% of their revenue into R&D and research, and really they've really built up this one platform that includes all the different customer data points scattered around the organization, bringing it all together and really creating interfaces that are more streamlined and more innovative towards today's world. And so I find that very fascinating because I think that took a lot of courage. It took a lot of guts from the top management to say, okay, look, listen, guys, we know we're playing in a very traditional industry, but we must reinvent ourselves, and this is something we will put money down and really change the entire organization and culture for.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent insight. I want to take a step back even further, or maybe look at the big picture, because now you're at Lufthansa Innovation Lab in Singapore. But this is not your first role in Asia or Asia Pacific. You've played different roles in that innovation ecosystem. And this is something I struggle with today because I've been doing a bunch of stuff with China. And I wanted to get your opinion. So, when it comes to innovation and cross border ventures, is China part of Asia or is it like a place of its own? Does it have like different rules of engagement?
Yeah, I think China is very, very different. I think because a lot of Western companies got blocked during 2010, China has developed its own very unique ecosystem around the internet. So you can see that with WeChat. You see how the big internet companies have created their own ecosystems, and there's quite a bit of a lockdown, a lock-in effect when it comes to customer engagement or consumer activity. And I don't think you can see it anywhere else in the world. And I think that is also why it's so hard for Western companies to really enter China. But likewise, it is very difficult for Chinese companies to actually also win Western markets because the ecosystems are so different, the customer behaviors are so different. And I give you one example on that one. I'm not sure how it is today, but there was a time where Western companies have tried or were going down the road of standalone apps. I remember Facebook, and Facebook took out the group app, the Messenger app, out of their main ecosystem because the Western consumers wanted something cleaner and minimalistic, while in China it's the direct opposite, and you try to put as many features into one app because in China, because of shorter attention spans, it's so important to keep the people engaged within your own ecosystem and app. And so you see very, very divergent you know design mantras, if you want, and also customer behaviors.
But still, I see a lot of people, even though it's so different and so challenging, I see a lot of organizations still kind of trying to crack, this cross border venture challenge. And so I want to give some, perhaps some assistance to our audience. And so if you're a startup listening to us right now, wanting to go into China, um, what do you think is something that they need to know? Like, what's the most important thing that they need to know?
Yeah, the most important thing is that it's not going to be a free lunch. China has become really, really competitive. I think from a customer acquisition cost perspective, it's become one of the most expensive places on planet Earth, because you have to pay a lot of money to like influencers, for example, which is more or less like one of the only effective ways of how to really reach customers if you really want to do it in a systematic way and it's not word of mouth. Because just remember, Google doesn't work. You can't just like put ads on Facebook and then just run with it, right? So it's a little bit different from a growth hacking point of view. And so typically China becomes really, really expensive really quickly. That's number one. Number two, I think whenever people think about China, yes, it's a big market, holds a lot of potential, but it's also a long term game, right? And if you were to look at some of the more successful Western companies into China, I think LinkedIn is a good example. They got into the market 2014. They did it with a local partner, local VC partner, even. So, what I mean by that is like they had really good ties to the Chinese government. They were really embedded into the Chinese ecosystem. And even then, I think now they have a penetration of not more than 50% in China. And so a lot of business is still run by local agents, really offline, actually. So they've been around for 6 years and they've invested quite a bit of money. Look at Starbucks. I mean, they got into the market in 1999, and now they're at a point where they're really like viewed as a very um, prestigious or premium coffee brand. But even they get attacked by a lot of smaller players that are very quick in like coffee delivery, for example. So my point being, China holds a lot of potential, but for startups to really get into China, you need to be really in for the ride and really invest long term and put quite a bit of money on the table. Otherwise, I wonder whether it would be a better decision to put your investment money somewhere else.
And if you were a startup still looking into Asia, Asia Pacific, if not China, or let's say China is more difficult, where would you go?
I mean, based in Singapore, I do see a lot of growth potential within the Southeast Asian markets. I think Southeast Asia is really a growth field or growth region, and you see a lot of um, business models picking up around e-commerce, around payments, around logistics. So in a way, it does Southeast Asia follows the trajectory of China. And if you want, maybe it's a China like 10 or 20 years ago, I don't know. But it could be interesting for companies to come into Southeast Asia because you really have a growing or rising middle class income section, right? And it's a little bit less cutthroat, I'd say, than China.
Christine, how can our listeners learn more about you? And maybe we haven't spoken about what you do at Lufthansa, but maybe they're interested in learning more about the Innovation Hub in Singapore. What's the best way to do that?
Sure. I think finding me on LinkedIn is definitely one way. My email is mail@wangchristine.com. So people who are interested can drop me an email. I'm really passionate about connecting with people within the space. I'm always passionate about like talking and connecting with entrepreneurs or corporates that are trying to figure out the right process for innovation at their organization. So, having been in this field for 11 years, I've been seeing a lot of different models and different ways of how to do innovation. So, happy to share my thoughts and my experience on that.
Thank you very much, Christine. I'll put all that information in the show notes. Again, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.